Cuba is crumbling. Now, in this case, my friends, we are not talking about its authoritarian communist government, at least not yet. We are not talking about its fleet of cars straight out of the 1950s and 60s, though that is definitely true regardless. No, my friends, we are quite literally talking about its infrastructure and integrity as a whole. The country itself is physically falling apart. At the time that I'm writing this, on October 22nd, 2024, Cuba's electrical grid has collapsed at least 4 times since this past Friday, repeatedly plunging around 10 million people into complete darkness. The grid's complete failure follows weeks of planned rolling blackouts that the government has desperately utilized in order to try and keep the country nominally active, and comes as Tropical Storm Oscar just made landfall in eastern Cuba this past weekend. Oscar was a Category 1 hurricane with winds up to 75 miles per hour when it made landfall in the eastern Cuban province of Guantanamo, near the city of Baracoa on Sunday evening. Flooding in low-lying areas was reported, and multiple deaths would occur as the country would plunge underwater and under darkness at the same time. Except, my friends, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about a simple power outage that was caused by a storm. Unlike what has happened with other storms that were the cause of outages across regions in the United States, this problem for Cuba has been happening before the storm and happening repeatedly. It's just gotten significantly worse. Authorities in the country would say, as of the time that I'm writing this, that they hope to restore electricity by the end of today, which is, again, Tuesday, October 22nd, by relying on smaller grids to power each region until the national grid is able to be stabilized, if it even can in the first place. Still, even if it is fixed, that does not mean that it is going to stay up. It is likely to go down at any given point. Prolonged blackouts are the result of broader challenges that are facing Cuba, and those are not simply going away once Oscar passes and power is restored. Those are still going to be there. The most obvious of these challenges is Cuba's failed state-managed economic model, which has struggled for decades but has been in full-blown crisis in recent years due to a series of external exacerbating factors and historical context, which I will briefly state here before going in and explaining anything else. Just looking at the past decade or so, since the late 2010s, the political and economic crisis in Venezuela would go and interrupt the flow of affordable oil to Cuba, which for the preceding 15 years had allowed the country to climb back from the economic crisis that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s. Along with this, secondly, the Trump administration would reverse virtually all the US policy reforms that were associated with the Obama administration's normalization of relations with Cuba, reimposing travel bans on US citizens and limits on remittances to the island. Third, and arguably the most important, you then have the COVID-19 pandemic, which would go and absolutely destroy Cuba's tourism industry, which represented its last remaining source of being able to get hard currency from outside sources to be able to use to actually buy things. The result of which has been a country that for decades has been on life support, and now all power systems are failing. The country itself is crumbling. The question then remains then, just how exactly did we get here in the first place, and how bad are things going to get? As I already mentioned, Cuba has been in a state of severe crisis for at least the past year, and as it stands, that is only set to get worse. I did a video on a similar topic here back during the protest that would be seen around 6 months ago in April over food shortages and blackouts then. But now, as I said, the situation has only gotten worse. Which on that note, my friends, hey, I got a whole merch line that's going to be dropping here on November 1st, 2024, so make sure to check those out. It's a great way to support the channel considering how YouTube has been of late. But either way, my friends, to explain things and answer these questions, we are going to need to go first back and explain some context. Depending upon where you get your information from and your political leanings, you may blame the communist government and its abuse of the people, along with mismanagement of its economy. You may blame the United States and its sanctions that cripple the state, or anything and everything in between. It really depends upon where you are. The reality is a little bit more complicated though, so keep that in mind and let's take a step back in time and explain just how the Cuban economy and state became so completely, terribly broken. But my friends, before we explain all of that, there's something else that has also been going on here. This past year or so, we've seen a number of high-profile security breaches. Fairly recently, National Public Data would go and announce that they had suffered a major breach, potentially impacting every single American. The incident would compromise over 2.9 billion records used for background checks, including critical personal information such as full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and most importantly, social security numbers. I'm saying this right now, but if you who is watching this have not actually taken steps in order to be able to protect yourself from these kinds of leaks, to protect yourself from information of yourself and your family being exposed online, you need to do that because now it is more important in this day and age than ever before. Considering everything that it is that I talk about on my varying different channels, I have been come after by varying different extreme groups of different political and economic ideologies. But thankfully, because I use today's sponsor, Aura, I'm actually able to feel more secure about things. Aura goes and monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of different data points like the dark web and public court records in order to alert you about potential identity theft. Even if something does happen, they also provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance in case that goes down. Considering everything it is that I have been through over the past several years, including a really big incident that I experienced in 2022, which almost shut me down from being able to create anything myself that I do now, I can't mess around with this kind of stuff here anymore. I can't. Please, by all means, go and click my link down in the description and get yourself a 2-week subscription of Aura for free. You can try it out. Even if you don't keep things, that is at least enough time to find out through Aura if your data has been exposed already. It is worth it to just check, and I want to make sure that everyone who follows me here is actually safe. Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video and also protecting me and my family. Now back to the show. To begin, my friends, I'm not going to explain literally everything, even though, again, this is, of course, the history of everything, and that's what I kind of do, because that would take far too long with way too many details. As it is, this video that I'm working on, just by virtue of the script, I know it's going to be one of the longest ones I've ever created. There is that much crap leading to why Cuba is so incredibly broken, and just how bad it is. A lot of details do need to be explained, though, because they are important. People need to understand them and how all of these tie together to create the terrible state we have today. Which, on that note, the history of modern Cuba began with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Yeah, please don't look at me like that. I understand, but trust me, this is, again, kind of important. Though discovered by the Spanish, native peoples inhabited the island, but were soon eliminated or died as a result of diseases or shock of conquest. Very few natives actually remained on Cuba after colonization, which meant that the impact of indigenous groups on subsequent Cuban society was actually quite limited, especially in comparison to places that you would see in Central and South America. This meant that Spanish culture, institutions, language, and religion would prevail as not only dominant, but basically unchallenged. Colonial society would develop slowly after Spain colonized the island in the 16th and 17th centuries, and pastoral pursuits and agriculture would serve as the basis of its economy. Fast forwarding quite a bit of time, for the first 3 centuries after the conquest, the island remained a neglected stopping point for the Spanish fleet, which would go and visit the New World and then return to Spain with the mineral wealth of continental America. That is where everything truly relied for the Spanish crown. Now, I know that look on your face, but please, trust me, I understand it's important that we had to explain this part. Fast forward a bit of time, and Cuba would awaken quite dramatically in the 19th century. The growth of the United States as an independent nation, the collapse of Haiti as a sugar-producing colony, and Spanish protective policies would all help to converge in order to be able to produce a sugar revolution on the island. With Haiti no longer there to compete and be the crown jewel of sugar of the Caribbean, Cuba, in just a few short years, was transformed from a sleepy, unimportant island to the major sugar producer in the world. Slaves would arrive in increasing numbers, large estates would squeeze out smaller ones, sugar would overtake tobacco, agriculture, and cattle as the main occupation of pretty much anyone who was anyone on the island. With this, prosperity would replace poverty, at least on paper, and more importantly, Spain would start focusing significantly more attention upon the island instead of neglecting it. This is important to mention because not only is this building the economy of what would be the economy of Cuba even to this very day, but simultaneously this is the very thing that would stop Cuba from gaining its independence for longer periods of time in comparison to what you would see with Latin and South America, which largely had been breaking with Spain over the course of the 19th century. Remember this part for later. Sugar was everything for Cuba. It made the island what it was. Towards the end of the 19th century, Cuban loyalty, though, began to change. A 10-year war would break out against Spain from 1868 to 1878, but this would fail to win independence. A second independence war from 1895 to 1898 would follow, and as a result of increasingly strained relations between Spain and the United States, along with other incidents, the Americans would enter the conflict in 1898. By December of that year, with the Treaty of Paris, the United States would emerge as the victorious power in the Spanish-American War, thereby ensuring the expulsion of Spain and U.S. tutelage, we will say, over Cuban affairs. Yes, Cuba would not become a part of the United States, it would not become a colony, but still, the United States would oversee it, we will say, which created a very interesting and unpopular dynamic. Fast forward a little bit of time, and on May 20th, 1902, after almost 5 years of US military occupation, Cuba would launch into nationhood with arguably fewer problems than most Latin American nations would experience in their own points of independence. Prosperity would increase during the early years. Militarism seemed curtailed. It wasn't going to be a really big problem. Social tensions were not big, at least not yet. At the same time, though, corruption, violence, and political irresponsibility were constant. And with time, they would grow. Due to the instability that this would create over time, the 1901 Platt Amendment would be invoked by the United States multiple times. Militarily, they would then be able to intervene in 1906 to 1909, 1917, and 1921. U.S. economic involvement would also weaken the growth of Cuba as a nation at this time and made the island exceptionally more dependent upon its northern neighbor. This is arguably one of the things that when people talk about relations between the United States and Cuba is one of the things that is brought up against the United States. But wait, it gets worse. After this, a series of US-backed military rulers and brutal dictators would follow over the course of the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s. That being until the government would eventually be overthrown by a different dictator that was not backed by the United States, Fidel Castro. You may be familiar with him. With time, as the Castro regime expropriated US properties and investments and began officially on April 16, 1961 to convert Cuba into a one-party communist system, relations between the United States and Cuba would rapidly deteriorate. The United States imposed an embargo on Cuba on October 19, 1960, and broke diplomatic relations on January 3, 1961. This being in response to Castro's expropriations without compensation and other provocations, such as arrests of US citizens. Though there would be several notable events, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, arguably tensions between the two governments would peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, after the United States would reveal the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Following the imposition of a US naval blockade, the weapons would end up being withdrawn and the missile bases were dismantled, thus resolving one of the most serious international crises since World War II that very well could have resulted in World War III. A US-Soviet agreement that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis would assure Cuba's protection from military attack by the United States, and subsequently tie it to the Soviet Union. And this, my friends, when we explain it, this is crucial for context as it leads to every single thing that we are talking about here today. Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union provided a protective umbrella that would propel Castro onto the international scene. He could pretty much do anything it is that he wanted. Cuba's support of anti-US guerrilla and terrorist groups in Latin America and other countries of the developing world, military intervention in Africa, and unrestricted access to Soviet weapons suddenly made Castro a very important international figure. Cuba, as a state, effectively became a communist stepping stone that could put the enemies of the United States within striking distance of it. And as a result, for decades, this relation meant that the Soviet Union would do anything and everything in its power to prop up the state and ensure that it survived, regardless of its internal problems and inefficiencies. That is what you need to understand, my friends. To that end, the sugar that we spoke about before, the thing that was the backbone of the Cuban economy for literally centuries, that would basically keep the entire country on life support. Not because it was super economically valuable or anything and a miracle product. No, it is because the Soviet Union would subsidize the terribly run Cuban state by overpaying for its sugar for literally decades. You see, my friends, due to historical dependence upon sugar, the Cuban economy was tied to external markets and price fluctuations, much in the same way that Argentina was tied to beef, Bolivia to resources like tin, and pretty much any major oil producer like Saudi Arabia is, well, tied to oil. I've talked about this before in multiple other videos, but it is never safe to have the overwhelming majority of your economy be dedicated to just one thing. It never is. Moreover, the United States remained the major source of capital and technology that was actually needed in order to invest in and operate the industry. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, Fidel Castro's government sought to end the monoproduction of sugar, and from that, tried to shift the Cuban economy towards self-reliance through industrialization and economic diversification. Which was a smart thing. You want to do this. You want to get rid of just your dependency upon one thing, and if you want to be self-sufficient, actually be self-sufficient in multiple areas. However, that being said, the industrialization effort failed horribly. While at the same time that these efforts were put into place, sugar production would decrease rapidly, and Cuba was, as a result, forced to return to sugar production in order to try and make ends meet. Yes, my friends, Cuba's sugar production suffered greatly at the beginning of the industrialization period in 1962. The communist state-mandated job restructuring by the government created a severe labor shortage at harvesting time, as state-run economies, well, as it turns out, typically kind of suck at running said economies. Along with this labor shortage, it did not help that the United States' embargo against Cuba would severely restrict imports to the country, including replacement parts for the machinery in sugar grinding mills that primarily came from the United States in the first place. Like, my friends, I need to stress just how stupid this whole thing was, because it genuinely makes me wonder what Castro thought would happen with the economy when he went hard against the entity that made everything about that economy possible in the first place. Either way, Cuba was floundering, and it needed a new partner to replace the United States. That replacement would come in the form of their ideological ally, the Communist Soviet Union. But the big problem with this switch was that it meant trading with an entity that was halfway across the globe versus 90 miles away from them like Florida in the United States was. This made transport and other costs of any kind of goods with the Soviet Union and related Eastern Bloc extremely high. Realistically, it was just very bad trading. So bad, in fact, that in 1963, Cuba's trade balance was 3 times worse than it had been back in 1962. Of Cuba's $700 million worth of imports, more than half of these imports were industrial parts, raw materials, and petroleum products, all goods that could not be obtained in Cuba because practically everything was dedicated to sugar. Cuba could also not afford then to finance new industries without taking on considerable debt, things that disincentivized the actual creation and diversification of new industries. As a result of these things, it meant that Cuba would be forced to return to the primary production of sugar and then depend on the Soviet Union as its major market to buy said sugar. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing. It's not great, but it's not necessarily too bad, because typically what one is able to do with a product when they are making a profit from it is that they are then able to take those profits and reinvest it back into the country in order to be able to build up other industries. Cuba, though, did not do this. Much in the same way as many oil nations do today, instead of diversification, Cuba would push sugar profits into social programs for its population, healthcare, education, etc. Things that would earn the favor of the people, but not actually develop the state and make it viable. It doesn't sound good, and it's really not, but for a while at least, this was not going to be a problem. The cost of sugar production was much higher in the Soviet Union than it was in Cuba, and the growing Soviet consumption of sugar meant that they did, in fact, need additional sources of it. In contrast, Cuba was a low-cost producer of sugar, and it needed the products that the Soviet Union could produce cheaply, such as oil, machinery, and anything else. On paper, for both parties, it was a win-win. But the balance of value between these goods were absolutely leagues apart. Raw sugar versus oil and complex machinery? Yeah, there's no real question about what has better value and who is getting the better end of the deal. Hint, hint, it's not the Soviets. Although Cuba was certainly in need of aid, Castro would go on to claim that the Soviets benefited more from the deal than they did, stating, and I quote, "They are not sacrificing their economy. On the contrary, it is economically advantageous to them. Why? Because the needs of their country are great. Their level of sugar consumption can increase considerably over what it is now, and sugar would cost much more to produce than it costs with us." End quote. Later on, this claim by Castro would be rejected by the varying different states of the Eastern Bloc, which ultimately would see their sugar purchases as just aid to a backwards country and very incompetently run economy that couldn't take care of itself. Ouch. That is not the most positive outlook by allies. But we're not quite there yet. Cuba and the Soviet Union would sign a long-term trade agreement in January of 1964 that allowed for the export of 24 million tons of sugar at a fixed price of 6.11 cents per pound from 1965 to 1970. Due to the decreasing sugar prices after 1963, this meant that the Soviet Union during that time period was paying almost twice what the world price of sugar was in order to be able to subsidize Cuba and keep it afloat. It was a terrible deal for them, but they were going to do anything that they possibly could in order to keep the state afloat and on the doorstep of the United States. In addition to straight up overpaying, they also were not getting all the product that they were supposed to in the first place. Cuba failed to increase its sugar production to the promised level of 10 million tons by 1970, which would result in the Soviet Union subsidizing Cuban sugar by more than $1.1 billion during this time period. it was not paid this money outright. No, instead the way that the trade system worked between Cuba and the Soviet Union would largely devolve into a bartering system, where raw goods were exchanged for raw goods. Or I say goods were exchanged for goods. Because you could have sugar being exchanged for just like a straight up tractor or something. These were goods that, because of these Soviet and Eastern Bloc economic models, which were, as we all know, absolutely fabulous, they would end up costing around 50% more than similar goods from non-Soviet countries. So even with being overpaid, they were still not getting bang for their buck. At the same time this happened, Cuba was also responsible for repaying loans to the Soviet Union, maintaining Soviet advisors, and military aid. This would end up getting so bad that by 1974, Cuba's debt to the Soviet Union was approximately $5 billion US. And guys, I am telling you this here right now, this economy made absolutely no sense whatsoever. 2 years after the end of the previous long-term deal, in 1972, Castro would negotiate a new long-term agreement with the Soviet Union in which Cuban debt would be deferred until 1986. They just straight up were not going to pay anything. And then, when it was going to be repaid, it was going to be interest-free and paid over the course of 25 years. Yeah, for anyone who is catching this here right now with no interest, that means that any inflation, anything at all, would result in the debt shrinking to practically nothing, so this was, again, pretty much just another form of subsidy that the Soviets were giving the Cubans. He would also manage to negotiate to raise the price of sugar to 11 cents per pound, which, mind you, at the time, was 2 cents more per pound than the actual world market price at the time. So hey, for the Cubans, that was a pretty good deal for them, right? That sounds pretty great. But wait, it gets worse. At the same time that the trade agreement overpaid the Cubans for their sugar at that point in 1974, the agreements also prevented Cuba from selling sugar on the world market, which meant that any price increase, anything at all, they were not able to actually take advantage of. And guess what? By November of 1974, thanks to a variety of different things, such as rising inflation, anticipation of rising demand from China, purchases from the USSR on the global market, large purchases by Arab nations, a bad European harvest, and the perception of imminent shortages meant that the price of a pound of sugar would end up rising to over 65 cents per pound by November. Remember though, Cuba had just signed a long-term agreement, as I said, for 11 cents per pound, and could therefore then do nothing. Instead of being subsidized merely 2 years after it made its deal, it was selling its sugar for 20% the cost of what it should have been. And that didn't really get better. Cuban sugar exports to the Soviet Union continued below the world price until the latter's collapse in 1991, accounting for more than 70% of the entire state's revenue. Yes, that is right. Even with the fact that the cost was 20% of what it should have been, it was still responsible for 70% of the entire state budget. Which, yes, that is really bad, but also remember what we say here. Wait, it gets worse. Because, my friends, everything would come to a crashing halt with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes, the near-global collapse of communism in the early 1990s had a profound effect upon Cuba. Soviet economic subsidies to Cuba would end as of January 1st, 1991. And without Soviet support, Cuba was submerged in a major economic crisis. The gross national product would contract by as much as 1/2 between 1989 and 1993. Exports would fall by 79%, and imports by 75%. The budget deficit would triple during this time, and the standard of living of the population would decline sharply. With the entire state seemingly on the verge of collapse, the Cuban government would give this time period a very special name, something that truly evokes the horror and misery of it. They would call it the Special Period in Peacetime. Yeah, with how lighthearted that name is, it all sounds pretty strange, but you have to understand that this was a very, very, very bad time for Cuba. How does something get this bad, though, you may wonder? Well, as I said before, while the massive Soviet subsidies did enable Cuba's enormous state budget and social programs, this did not actually lead to a more advanced or sustainable Cuban economy. Described by economists as a, quote, relatively highly developed Latin American export economy in 1959 and the early 1960s, Cuba's fundamental economic structure changed very little then. Between that time period and 1990, it essentially stayed the same for about 30 years. Tobacco products such as cigars and cigarettes were the only good that was actually manufactured among Cuba's leading exports. And one of the key problems with that kind of product is that even a pre-industrial society and process could produce these. You didn't need machinery to do it. There was nothing special about Cuba. Nothing at all. In fact, the only really special thing about it that you could say is that it somehow managed to stay alive despite everything that was going against it. The Cuban economy remained inefficient and overspecialized in just a few highly subsidized commodities provided by the Eastern Bloc countries. Tobacco, sugar, and other products, things that were being severely overpaid for, these were the things that would keep the economy afloat, particularly sugar, because that was something that was being bought at way above market price by the Soviets. With that gone, everything went to hell fast. The early stages of the special period were defined by a general breakdown in a variety of different sectors: transportation, agricultural, etc. Fertilizer and pesticide were primarily derived from petroleum, which meant that once all the oil was lost, you didn't have the ability to produce this anymore, which in turn meant lower agricultural yields. That would in turn mean widespread food shortages. With no fuel to speak of, waiting for a bus could take multiple hours. Power outages could last 12 to 16 hours a day, and food consumption was cut back to 20% of what it had previously been. The average Cuban during this time would lose around 20 pounds worth of weight. During the early years of this crisis, United States law would allow humanitarian aid in the form of food and medicine by private groups, but largely, Cuba was on its own. As time wore on, illegal immigration became a growing problem. The 1994 Balsero crisis, which was named after the makeshift rafts or other unseaworthy vessels used by thousands of Cubans, would constitute the most significant wave of Cuban illegal immigrants since the Mariel boat lift of 1980, when 125,000 people left the island. A Cuban-US agreement to limit illegal immigration had the unintended effect, then, of making alien smuggling of Cubans into the United States a major business, similar to what you'd see with coyotes. Then, in 1996, the US Congress would pass the so-called Helms-Burton Law, introducing tougher rules for US dealings with Cuba and deepening economic sanctions. The most controversial part of the law, which led to international condemnation of the United States policy towards Cuba, involved sanctions against third-party nations, corporations, or individuals that trade with Cuba. The US stance toward Cuba became progressively more hardline as time went on, when people were already suffering immensely. Mind you, when we talk about this is one of the places where people blame the United States and its sanctions for being the reason that Cuba is in the state that it is. But the thing is, those did not cause the special period. They did arguably make it worse, yes, but they did not cause it. Either way, the Cuban government was forced to contract more and more lucrative economic and tourism deals with various different European and South American nations in an attempt to try and earn foreign currency that was necessary to replace the lost Soviet oil via the international market. Additionally, faced with near elimination of imported steel and other ore-based supplies, Cuba would go and close refineries and factories all across the country, eliminating the country's very limited industrial arm and subsequently take out millions of related jobs in the process. My friends, to call this a mere special period is a gross understatement of the highest degree of government doublethink, something that you would more commonly associate with North Korea. It was that bad. Thousands of Cubans would go and protest in Havana on the 5th of August 1994, with some chanting "Libertad," freedom. The protest, in which some protesters would end up throwing rocks at police, was then dispersed by the police after a few hours. This arguably was the closest that the Cuban opposition would ever come to asserting itself decisively in the one-party state, as there was literally no other option for them. But either way, to alleviate the economic crisis, the government would introduce a few market-oriented reforms, including opening to tourism, allowing foreign investment, legalizing the US dollar, and authorizing self-employment for some 150 different occupations. And these measures would result in modest economic growth. What I mean by this is that the liberalized agricultural markets were introduced in October of 1994, at which state and private farmers could sell above quota production at free market prices, which would broaden legal consumption alternatives and reduce black market prices. Basically, to explain this, let's say that the state demand for lettuce was 1,000 heads of lettuce, and a farmer is thus incentivized to not produce more than 1,000 heads because they don't actually get paid anything extra for it, there's no reason for them to do it. Then under this new system, the state would still mandate that they had to grow a set amount, but then if the farmer made anything beyond that, like 1,100 heads of lettuce, they would be able to sell that 100 themselves and actually make a little bit more money. This would help things because it would actually incentivize farmers to grow more food at a time in which there wasn't much food. Go figure. The drop in GDP during the special period would halt in 1994, when Cuba would report a 0.7% growth. followed by increases of 2.5% in 1995 and 7.8% in 1996. Things would continue to grow for the next several years, albeit slowly, but living conditions in 1999 ended up remaining well below that of the 1989 level. Still though, there was going to be one factor amongst all these different things that would truly save the Cuban economy, at least for a time: Venezuela. Yes, my friends, in the early 2000s, Castro and Chavez would strike a barter deal that pulled Cuba from the depths of its economic crisis with generous amounts of petroleum. Essentially, what would happen is that Cuba got access to the largest oil reserves on the planet, and in exchange, they would send their doctors, coaches, and intelligence advisors and military advisors down to Venezuela. In this exchange, soon, Venezuela was sending the island roughly 100,000 barrels of oil a day. In exchange, Cuban doctors would set up clinics for the poor, which was Chavez's political base, in Venezuela's most downtrodden neighborhoods. Thousands of Venezuelans would travel free of charge to Havana to get medical treatment for everything from cataracts to gunshot wounds. It did not matter. It was all covered for by the state. With the oil flowing from Venezuela, Cuba was able to pay off its long-standing debts and revamp the island's faded tourism industry. The workers for oil deal ended up generating more income than rum, cigars, or pretty much anything that Cuba actually produced. During this time period, the island's citizens, the people themselves, became the main export of it. Cuban workers would return from postings in oil-rich Venezuela while carrying TVs, bottles of whiskey, and other expensive goods that they couldn't get back home. Relations were so close during this time period that Chavez would take to proclaiming that Cuba and Venezuela were not two separate countries. No, they were a single one, La Gran Patria, or the Big Homeland. Frequently, he would go and pop over to Havana for strategy sessions and to just play baseball games with Castro himself, of which there's actually a variety of images that you can see here. With cheap Venezuelan oil flooding Cuba, the command-style economy that was horribly inefficient was, at least for a time, safe. Things returned back to normal just as they had been under the Soviet Union, but barely so. Fast forward then around a decade, and in 2010, Fidel Castro, in what was really a huge move at the time, would admit that the Cuban economy that was based on the old Soviet centralized planning model was no longer sustainable. This was big. Instead, as this happened, Cuba was going to push for the development of cooperative variants of socialism, where the state plays a lesser active role in the economy. Things really seemed to be changing. Cuba would go and institute a series of reforms in 2011. From this new system, over 400,000 Cubans would be able to sign up in order to become entrepreneurs, and from that, work for themselves, not just the government. By 2012, the government would go and list 181 different official jobs that no longer had to be under their direct control. Things such as a construction worker, a taxi driver, a shopkeeper. Some roles you were able to do for yourself, but you still had to buy a license to do it, such as a well digger or a mule driver, but you still had more freedom than you would have done 20 or 30 years previously, which was awesome. But despite these openings, Cuba would still maintain nationalized companies for the distribution of all essential amenities, whether that was power, whether that was water, whether it was anything, and all essential services such as education, so for being a teacher, a doctor, for healthcare networks, whatever it needs be, all of that was still controlled by the state. And when it comes to these state-owned enterprises, my friends, as we've talked about before, while great for generating revenue for the state and allowing for direct control when it comes to, oil or other kinds of products, they are also usually horribly ran, completely inefficient, and terribly corrupt. And this would be the case for Cuba. Over the course of its existence, Cuba would much rather spend the cash that it would make from varying different sugar deals, from oil, from anything else, on just buying loyalty of its population through social programs and bribing officials than to actually go and improve its infrastructure, or business, or anything. But we will explain that more here in a bit, because I promise you the whole thing is just terrible, and I know that I've gone on for a long time about all of this, but you have to understand from everything that I've listed how everything is connected and why it is so bad. For now, in this time period that we're talking about, the inefficiencies, though bad, would not matter because, once again, the subsidies were rolling in. And during the next 8 years, this would effectively remain the status quo of Cuba. Remittances from Cubans who had fled the country would in turn be used to try and fuel economic activities at home and start new businesses. While this would happen, the state would struggle to stay afloat, spending years trying to have its foreign debts forgiven. As an example of what I'm talking about here, in 2011, China would forgive $6 billion of debt that was owed to it by Cuba. In 2013, Mexico would announce a $487 million loan that would have 70% of it waived. In 2014, before making a diplomatic visit to Cuba, Russian President Vladimir Putin would forgive over 90% of the debt that was owed to Russia by Cuba. For context of the amount that we're talking about here, that forgiveness totaled around $32 billion, which is a lot. The remaining $3.2 billion would then only be paid over the course of the next 10 years. Anyway, you get the idea. Cuba is trying to open itself up a bit more and modernize the economy. The state is trying to stay afloat. It's a pretty precarious situation overall, but it shouldn't be too bad, unless there is some kind of crippling event that could shut down the entire global economy, right? And yeah, that's definitely not going to happen. You all know exactly where this is going. 2019, COVID-19. The first sign of serious trouble would be the tanking of Cuba's greatest support, Venezuela. We've already covered before multiple times in previous episodes, but in the beginning of 2014, and accelerating then as time went on, Venezuela went into economic freefall, something that it still has not recovered from. This in turn would spark political unrest and acute shortages of vital resources, such as food, medicine, and electricity. The resulting crisis would drive millions of people from Venezuela in search of food, better living conditions, and work opportunities beyond its borders. As Venezuela's economy absolutely tanked, soon it was the Venezuelans that were working in Cuba who returned home with all the valuable goods that they couldn't get back home. Things such as toilet paper, toothpaste, soap. Basic items that at that point had all but disappeared from store shelves. With that, the sending of oil to Cuba would crater. By 2019, Cuba was only going to receive about 50,000 barrels of oil a day from Venezuela, about half of what it did during the boom years. That is a major loss as a fuel source. And as time went on, COVID-19 would happen, the pandemic would begin, and everything in the world would shut down. By the year 2020, the economic situation in Cuba was bad. Hint, hint, it got worse. Things got so bad that the Cuban economy would contract by a whopping 10% in 2020, which is huge, and 2% in the first 6 months of 2021. And when I explain this, my friends, there was no singular issue that would cause this. It was a variety of different factors that would occur. There was less subsidized fuel from Cuba's ally, Venezuela. The United States embargo against Cuba and sanctions were tightened by the Trump administration in 2019. And of course, you have the pandemic itself that all worked to bring the country to a grinding halt and destroy it. Tourism had for a while briefly brought in desperately needed foreign currency in order to be able to make purchases of foreign food imports and fuel on the global market. But the pandemic shut that down fast. Currency reforms would also lead to soaring inflation, with rates estimated to be 500%. Of course, the Cuban government was going to blame the crisis on the US trade embargo. Everything was the fault of the United States, as well as the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And to a degree, there was an element of truth in this. The United States did contribute to the issue. The Trump administration tightened certain sanctions against Cuba that had been lifted by the Obama administration, which greatly reduced the amount of money that was sent to the island by the Cuban diaspora from the US. The Trump administration would also ban trade with companies that were acting on behalf of the Cuban military, Cuban intelligence, and security services. It also forbade Americans to travel to Cuba for educational and cultural purposes. By the time Trump was out of office and the Biden administration came into power, Biden would ease some of the restrictions, but not all of them. And Cuba has remained on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which has kept it further isolated. After all, the outbreak of anti-government protests in the summer of 2021 and the government's subsequent repressive response and crackdown would draw fierce criticism from the United States and around the world. So yes, the US did contribute to some of the difficulties that Cuba faced. But these problems were already there and they were already bad. They just arguably got a bit worse because of it. Deteriorating economic conditions led to further reductions in Cuban standard of living. Shortages of food and other basic products, a shortage of hard currency, and persistent power outages would wreak havoc across the country. Promised economic reforms, which were needed and were another cause of discontent alongside the embargo, ended up not happening because the government was basically too busy managing the pandemic and dealing with the fallout of everything else. As problems mounted, protests would break out across the country in 2021, something that you could not just do in the communist utopia of Cuba. And so when this happened, the government cracked down hard. The government would make hundreds of arrests and charge at least 710 Cubans with crimes, including sedition, vandalism, theft, and public disorder. Amnesty International would criticize the government for making arbitrary arrests en masse, noting that the demonstrators were largely peaceful, but it did not matter if an individual did not throw a rock, everyone was arrested. As they would write about the matter, quote, "The authorities' default approach has been to criminalize nearly all of those who participated in the protest, including some children. This was not good, but arguably it was going to get worse once things actually then went to trial. Human rights groups would largely condemn the trials of demonstrators as completely lacking any kind of fairness. You see, my friends, Cuba does not have the freedom of assembly. They don't have this. Unauthorized public gatherings are illegal. And so even the mere act of showing up to a place as part of a group could get you arrested. For a while, people just straight up disappeared with no news of an actual trial taking place. In fact, the government would acknowledge for the first time that trials had occurred in January of 2022, when the public prosecutor's office would say that 172 people had already been tried and convicted. There was no public knowledge about this. They were just taken, whisked away, set up with a trial, and locked up instantly. Sentences for demonstrators would range from 4 to 30 years in jail. At the time that this happened, the Cuban government would continuously promote conspiracy theories blaming Western countries, especially the United States, of being responsible for the protests, without ever actually providing any evidence of it. The Cuban government would suppress photographers and journalists that were reporting on the event, would shut off the internet, and would make it impossible then for pictures and videos of the protest and violence against protesters to be shared on social media. Things would not come out until long after. And while bad, these protests would effectively set the tone for how things were going to go for the next 3 years or so with Cuba. Look, I know that I've been going on here about this all for a while and explaining a lot of different things, but I have to add all this here because the amount of people that try to just gloss over how Cuba conducts itself and say, oh no, it is a fair and free society where the only bad things that ever happen are because of the United States. It's quite frankly ridiculous. The United States is not innocent. I have already shown that. I have already talked about that. I have already demonstrated it. It is not innocent by any means, but that has no bearing upon how the government of Cuba actually runs and administers things, which, if you did not get by now, is terrible. But that, my friends, then brings us to this year, 2024, a point in which I already covered in the spring that it had been marred by blackouts and severe food shortages. Cuba's communist government, which uses a rationing system to provide a certain amount of food per household, would start to limit its allocations of bread only to children and pregnant women. This would lead to widespread suffering, but now it has just gotten worse as the blackouts change from sporadic to occasional to near constant. This, in turn, has largely shut off water services in parts of the country, and the little food that people had in refrigerators in this time has gone bad, as the refrigerators cease to operate without any kind of electricity to power them. Mind you, when we talk about this issue with power, experts had already been warning for years that this was going to happen. Cuba's power grid was on the verge of collapse, relying on plants that were nearly half a century old and importing fuel that the strapped-for-cash communist government did not have. And so on the morning of October 18th, these predictions ended up coming true, as the entire island would plunge into the most prolonged blackout it has suffered in the past 3 decades. Here is what you need to understand. For years, Cuba has been plagued by rolling blackouts. That is something that has always happened, but it would be for a few hours a day, maybe every other day. Maybe it would happen once over the course of a week, with the majority of these things being concentrated in the countryside that either could have been hit by some kind of hurricane, or maybe they didn't get a fuel shipment in time, something along those lines. But this time is different. Residents are comparing this to the special period of the early 1990s and saying that this could be even worse than the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cuban economists and foreign analysts blame the crisis on several different factors. You have the government's failure to tackle the island's aging infrastructure, the decline in fuel supplies from Venezuela, Mexico, and Russia, and a lack of capital investment in badly needed renewable systems such as wind and solar. Cuba just really does not have any alternatives or proper infrastructure, because for 50 years, it didn't really invest in it. Again, preferring to run social programs instead, as I already explained. As one New York Times article would say, citing Jorge Pinon, a Cuban-born energy expert at the University of Texas at Austin, quote, "Cuba's electricity grid relies on 8 very large power plants that are close to 50 years old. They have not received any operational maintenance, much less capital maintenance, in the last 12 to 15 years. He would go on to add that these were plants that typically had a lifetime of only 25 to 30 years. and they were at this point over double that. What this means, my friends, is that Cuba's power plants are old, way older than is healthy, and they are not being maintained. Compounding this issue and lack of maintenance, Cuba burns crude oil for fuel for its plants. Cuba does produce some fuel, but its crude oil production is very heavy in sulfur and metals that further impair the thermoelectric combustion process and damage the plant. That means that because of how they are operated, these plants should be receiving more maintenance and repairs than what would be done with other types of fuel sources. But instead of that happening, they are instead receiving less. They have to constantly be repaired, but like a leaky dam that you are just taping over the cracks on, eventually, that's not going to be enough, and the whole thing is going to just collapse. As Jorge Pinion would put it, if you wanted to compare Cuba's electrical system to anything, it was essentially an almendron, which is a term used in Cuba for the classic American cars from the 1950s that appear in every tourist photo. Quote, "The engine of the almendron breaks down. A tire fails, and you fix it. Next month, it's the carburetor, which will then break down. It's as if you wanted to go and compete in the Monaco Grand Prix with that 1950s car. The Cuban economy and electrical system was an old car that was constantly breaking down and in need of repair. The whole thing was bad." Which, my friends, at this point, it brings up a very important question though. Why did Cuba do this? Why not develop other forms of electricity production? Well, they did try, at least to a degree. It just didn't really work out. Going back a bit of time, in the 1970s, Cuba did try to get into nuclear power to a degree. Fidel Castro would send one of his sons to study nuclear physics in Moscow. And from that, work began on a nuclear power plant on Cuba's south coast, but nothing would ever really happen with it. Only the concrete outer shell was built, and the project was mothballed in the 1990s once everything with the Soviets just collapsed. Theoretically, if the Soviet Union had lasted for 5 or 6 more years, then potentially Cuba could have had a nuclear power plant. We don't know. Considering how everything was constructed, done, and operated, the chances of it being any good are low at best. Fast forward a bit of time, and in the year 2006, after Cuba began having severe power shortages because of hurricanes knocking things out in the summer months, Castro realized that the power plants were not going to be enough, and he would go and import thousands of huge diesel-powered generators, each capable of providing enough power for rural towns and villages all along the countryside. This was, all things considered, a good temporary measure. It was something that would help the people and give them some of their power capabilities back. But it was just that, temporary. More recently, Cuba has turned to leasing about half a dozen massive Turkish ships that operate as mobile power stations, capable of generating around 20% of Cuba's electricity, which is quite a bit. But the problem is, the lease agreement that Cuba has with Turkey requires that Cuba supplies the fuel for the ships and generators, which, again, considering everything we've talked about, is arguably the biggest problem. Since all of these events, demand for fuel has caused diesel and other fuel prices to skyrocket, putting a strain on Cuba's finances even more. Almost all of that fuel has to be purchased from abroad, from which there is no money to get it. Cuba produces around 40,000 barrels of fuel a day. But in terms of consumption, it consumes around 120,000 barrels a day. That is 80,000 more than it produces. Until about a year ago, the deficit of some 80,000 barrels was covered by different shipments. Cuba would take whatever money it could get and it would use it to buy oil, mostly from Venezuela, plus smaller amounts from Mexico and sometimes from Russia. But now, those imports have fallen significantly. In regards to the actual amount we're talking about here, Venezuela's shipments have fallen to around 25 or 30,000 barrels a day, down from the 50,000, which was half of the 100,000 that it previously was. This means that the largest oil producer that they're able to get oil from only meets about a third of Cuba's import needs. More oil is not on the way either. After the Biden administration temporarily relaxed Venezuelan oil sanctions earlier this year to encourage its government to allow free and fair elections, the South American country, instead of selling it to Cuba for a discounted price, began to sell more of its supply to foreign oil companies in order to get cash to try and help with its own economic crisis, which has been going on for the better part of a decade now. Again, something that I have covered multiple times on this channel, and that situation is not getting any better. So then, not only is this not enough oil for Cuba, but at the same time, imports are costing the Cuban state around $600 to $700 million a year, money that the state simply does not have. And that, my friends, has left Cuba in a terrible position. Russia has not made up the oil shortfall as many people expected that it would, and Mexico's own oil production has fallen to a 45-year low this year, one of the steepest output declines anywhere in the world this century. Which actually, now that I mentioned that itself would be a fascinating video as well. Once one of the world's most successful oil companies, the Mexican state-owned firm Pemex has been falling increasingly into debt over the past decade, only surviving by pursuing cheaper shallow water oil operations and also being bailed out by the government. It is no longer the cash cow that is able to fuel growth and development for the Mexican state. Many people are wondering at this point how long it's actually going to be able to stay afloat. But either way, no help would be coming to Cuba. The world is either too distracted or not in a secure enough position themselves to do anything. The state is bankrupt, and its authoritarian crackdowns, along with desperate economic situation, have resulted in over 1 million people fleeing the country as things got even worse. Which, yes, my friends, if you're wondering at the amount that I'm talking about here, around 10% of Cuba's population, that is more than 1 million people, left the island between 2022 and 2023, per the country's National Statistics Office. This would make it the largest migration wave in all of Cuban history. According to the official figures made public for the first time, Cuba's population went from 11,181,595 on December 31st, 2021, down to 10,055,968 by December of 2023. We're talking about the mass exodus of 1,011,269 Cubans. The population in 2024 is now closer to what it was in 1985. Most of these migrants would end up coming to the United States. According to U.S. border immigration statistics, 645,122 Cubans would come to the U.S. seeking asylum at the border with Mexico and through a legal parole program created by the Biden administration from October of 2021 to June of 2024. Quote, such statistics represent the largest migratory flow in the history of Cuba, both before and after the revolution, much more numerous than any of the previous migratory waves since 1959. Mind you, when I say this, what we are talking about here, what we are providing, are the conservative official numbers. The problem may actually be worse than that. In a paper that was published by the Cuban Research Institute and written by Juan Carlos Albizu Campos, a professor at the University of Havana, this would estimate that the real population decrease was not 10%, it was 18%, to only 8.62 million people between 2022 and 2023. Of the potential millions that we are talking about here that have left, the overwhelming majority of those people are naturally, as one expects from those who leave, between the ages of 15 and 59, the most productive points in people's lives. Combine that with the island's increasingly older population, and you then have a severe labor crisis on top of the economic crisis, something that only serves to drive up the cost of social programs and make everything worse. Along with that, my friends, food production has absolutely collapsed in Cuba. As Alexis Rodriguez Perez, a senior official at the Cuban Ministry of Agriculture, would say, the country produced 15,200 tons of beef in the first 6 months of this year. That sounds like a lot, and yeah, I guess it kind of is, but relative to the size of the country, that is terrible. As a comparison, Cuba produced 172,300 tons of beef in 2022. Which, yeah, that is a really bad drop then, but even that number was down 40% from 289,000 in 1989. So think on that, 289,000 down to 15,000. Pork production was even worse. The country produced barely 3,800 tons in the first 6 months of this year, and compare that to 149,000 tons in all of 2018. Almost every other sector would report severe losses and failed production goals. Cuba, my friends, is crumbling before our very eyes, and there is nothing that it seems that anyone, the government, the people, outside powers, anyone can do about it. Still, the government of Cuba is going to do what it has always done, try to downplay the crisis and maintain control, while simultaneously blaming outside powers like the United States. In parts of the country, some Cubans have been on the street protesting, despite the sharp warnings from President Diaz-Canel, who said in a public address that such actions would not be tolerated and, quote, will be prosecuted with the rigor that the revolutionary laws contemplate. Remember, as I've already said, Cuba does not have the right to assembly. Still though, at the moment, despite all of those things, despite all the pain and suffering of the population, protests don't seem to have grown into a mass movement for political change. Cubans do not hold Diaz-Canel with the same kind of regard as they did Castro, but also at the same time, the regime is still powerful. It has a significant amount of clout and state power to enact violence against any kind of protesters. Crackdowns against dissidents have been on the rise in recent years, as dissidence itself has also risen. Could things change? Well, yes, maybe. Anything could, technically speaking, happen, but it's unlikely. According to William Leogrand, a professor of government and specialist in Latin American affairs at American University, quote, even if there were a significant call for regime change, there's nothing to change to, end quote. Over the years, my friends, discontent has been growing, and it is pretty widespread right now, but there isn't any kind of real organized opposition. Cuba has been a one-party state for decades, and that is not something that actually allows for organized opposition to be able to grow and develop to provide an alternative. Instead of fixing things, the government just makes it easier for people to leave the country. It is better for people to leave than to stay there and be a dissident. And so that is what people end up doing. Anyone who is truly angry enough with the regime will likely not even try to change it. Instead, they will just leave Cuba and go elsewhere, leaving it to stagnate and degrade even further. As time goes on, potentially millions of more Cubans could theoretically flee Cuba, which as it ages would likely collapse demographically. Really, at this point, there is no telling just how many people will do so by the end of the decade, and where Cuba will be. It is withering away and crumbling before our very eyes. But, my friends, at this point, that is really the end of today's video. I hope that over the course of all this, I've explained as to why Cuba is so incredibly broken and why there really is no end in sight for it. For all of you who stuck around to the end, thank you all very much. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Check me out on Patreon if you want to hear more episodes of the actual podcast ad-free. And simultaneously, don't forget to check out my merch, which is going to be dropping here on November 1st, 2024, which at the time that I hope that I am getting this thing made and I actually get it back from my editor means that it will be out before that, I hope. Thank you, my friends, for listening, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, guys.